Today, we remember the man who led the greatest movement against racism and for social justice in history. Although famous for his support of African American equality, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood up through nonviolence against any injustice, whether the issues were concerning race, poverty, or war. January 15, 2009 would have been Martin Luther King's 80th birthday. On January 20th, we will be inaugurating America's first African American president. To commemorate this historic Martin Luther King Day, we sat down with Reverend Gilbert H. Caldwell. Reverend Caldwell is a doctor of theology, a civil rights leader, member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and a personal friend of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
My name is Gilbert H. Caldwell, and after going to school in North Carolina, I attended Boston University School of Theology. I first heard Dr. King before I actually met him. There was something called a prayer pilgrimage that was celebrating the Supreme Court decision of '54. So there was a rally in Washington, I guess it must have been in 1957. And I remember riding down from Boston to hear him there.
As a man who closely worked with Dr. King, Reverend Gilbert Caldwell provides insight into the movement and the man who changed America.
But then in 1958, I was then a senior in graduate school at the School of Theology, and Martin King was in town to speak at some gathering. I think there was a forum, and with the kind of impetuousness of a senior in graduate school, I said, gee, why don't I try to call the guy, see if I could get through to him. I found out where he was staying, called his hotel room, and said, Dr. King, you're in town to speak for another event. Would you be willing to come out to Boston University, your alma mater, where you got your PhD? And strangely enough, he said yes. And so we, of course, invited him. He spoke to classes, spoke to the School of Theology student body and faculty. And then I've got a picture where a group of us students were with him in the downstairs cafeteria. And we had a picture, but it was just a great experience meeting him. And I, of course, was sort of, struck. It was hard initially, but then he's a very, very, very quiet man in many ways. His persona around a table was a bit different from his persona when he was at a lectern or a rostrum or a pulpit. But that was in 1958, and gee whiz, that's, 51 years ago? Yeah, it was the spring of 1958, yeah, so it was quite a while ago.
Reverend Caldwell goes on to discuss the segregated society that he and Dr. King were born into.
See, I think it's important, and of course, being involved in history, being clearly aware of the social environment that in fact provoked or involved Martin King. One of the things that I say about myself, I'm 76 years old this year, born in North Carolina, and so I was born into America's racial apartheid. So that I'm a segregation survivor, and it's important to know that, of course, Dr. King would have been 80 if he'd lived on January 15th, so he and I are of the same generation. And so he was born in the South, as was I, and we were born into a situation where one of the great contradictions of our nation is racial segregation, with all of our rhetoric about equality. And so, of course, that was a motivating factor, so that, in fact, to grow up as a person of African descent in the Deep South as we were, that has a way of sort of shaping one's life in so many ways. And of course, therefore, that shaped Dr. King's life. And then, of course, we know by almost accident, he, of course, after finishing Morehouse College, then went to Rosa Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania for his theological work to prepare for the ministry. And then he decided to do a doctorate, and he did that at Boston University in systematic theology.
Segregated America created a division of all public accommodations. This system forced African Americans to sit on the back of the buses while whites sat in the front. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man on December 1, 1955. This brave act sparked the Montgomery bus boycott.
But of course, we know what happened, that there was this whole matter of bus segregation in Montgomery. He had just taken a church in Montgomery, and lo and behold, he became the president of a group called the Montgomery Improvement Association. And of course, a new person on the scene, a young person, a brilliant person, but somehow the forces involved him, and as a result of that, of course, he became such a significant person. Sometimes we say, of course, that we know the name Rosa Parks, because she, of course, is the person who decided not to move from her seat to the back of the bus, but rather sat there, and she was arrested. And of course, Martin King became the leader of that movement, the bus boycott. But one of the things that we sometimes say is that Rosa Parks, because she sat down, she enabled Martin King and thousands of other people to stand up for rights.
Reverend Caldwell reflects on the strategy of nonviolence and the historical importance of the civil rights movement.
Martin King, because of the influence of Gandhi, because of the influence of a friend of mine also, James Lawson, who had spent some time in India, and this whole idea that a movement in a society like this would best be served by being nonviolent. The whole concept, of course, it was tactical, but it was also spiritual. That if, in fact, one is attempting to transform people and yet continue to live with them, you must not demean them, you must not dehumanize them. For even though they mistreat you, to be human, to be complete is certainly not to mistreat them. So I think in many ways, and in fact the letter that I prepared that I hope you'll find ways to use, that I sort of wrote to Justin, to his history professor, and to all of you, this idea that we know that Tom Brokaw of NBC wrote that book talking about the greatest generation, talking about World War II and the soldiers, etc. But I would say that the civil rights movement was, I think, America's greatest social justice movement. And that's, of course, what it became. And I think, as we look at what's happening today, that it was because of the civil rights movement that we were able to move from a segregated society to what we would call a desegregated society, that is to say, blacks and whites and others together. But then, of course, moving toward the goal of integration, where there is authentic sharing of peoples, and we still, of course, are about that.
Police violence in places like Selma and Birmingham, Alabama, proved to be shocking to Americans.
Yeah, and of course, one of the things that sort of awakened America, seeing, of course, the fire hoses, the dogs, etc., in Birmingham and elsewhere, and that was a turning point, because in fact, throughout the nation, there was a kind of an apathy. But when in fact children and older people get knocked down by water hoses, and when dogs are set upon them, then people have a way of waking up. And I guess, and I think we've heard this from Obama, that there is a goodness, there is a best in people that unfortunately so often is covered up. People simply go along with what seems to be the prevailing reality. But I have a feeling that as people sort of had to look at their TV screens and see the violence, and of course see the contradiction, then of course that was an awakening moment.
It's come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south. Where legal remedies are not at hand, redress is sought in the streets, in demonstrations, parades, and protests, which create tensions and threaten violence and threaten lives. Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
Selma and Montgomery, of course, you know that was an effort to deal with the whole matter of voting rights. And that Bloody Sunday in Selma, where, of course, John Lewis and others were beaten as they attempted to start the march. And so I went to Selma, I guess 2 days after that. A cry had gone out from Selma that we need people to come from all over the nation, blacks and whites and others, to simply indicate that this is not just a black movement, but we're talking about what it means to be an American. And so I went there. I was there for 2 parts of the Selma Montgomery March. I was living in Boston at the time. I was pastor of a church in Boston South End. And one of the persons I got to know in Boston was a Unitarian minister whose name was James Reeb, Reverend James Reeb, a Unitarian Universalist minister a wonderfully quiet person, and he in fact was on the plane with me as we rode from Boston to Atlanta, and then of course took cars from Atlanta to Selma. And of course we know the story that on that second day of the march, Jim Reeb, this white minister from Boston, after we of course marched and did not go, we went across the bridge, Jim Reeb was coming out of a restaurant, and he with some others, and he was set upon, and he was beaten, and he of course was killed and died a few days later. I think, and again, I think one of the things also is that the deaths of white persons indicated, first of all, that the surprise that some people have, not understanding that there are some people who identify with the other, that there's authentic empathy, and that in fact your struggle is my struggle. Martin King said it, of course, so very well. He said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Freedom Summer was a movement to register voters in Mississippi. Here, civil rights workers were met with resistance and violence.
I had seen that. I was in Mississippi for Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964. You may have looked at that in your history lessons, where of course we were invited to be involved in voter registration, and I was working in a kind of a community center working with young people. And that was the time when those 3 civil rights workers were killed. 1 black, 2 white, 2 were Jewish, of course, 1 was African American, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. And so you had those deaths, you see, that were a part of the movement. And so I think as I spent my time on picket lines, etc., I knew that there was danger. People were knocked down, people were shot at, and then of course we know about the assassinations. Of course, not only King, but Medgrevers and other persons. And so I think we must never discount the brutality. We're living in a time when people say, well, we're in a post-racial or post-racist era. And that in some ways, we're at another place. But who was it, Santa Anna, who said that if you do not remember your history, you're likely to repeat it.
A driving force and backbeat behind the civil rights movement was music. It provided comfort and divine inspiration.
I mean, he had his doubts. As one reads his biography, there were moments when he was in great despair, where he was on the verge of giving up. Obviously, he of course experienced great violence and jailing, but it's a model for how we live our lives, and there's in fact joy in the struggle. In fact, I'm going to do what I don't know that I've done this on camera before. But I'm going to do it anyway. In fact, I'm going to ask folk to join in. This is very unusual. Maybe there was a song that we used to sing in the movement that comes out of the church. But I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Now I'm going to ask the voices here in this magnificent studio, all of these magnificent, brilliant students, the cameraman as well as the professor, to sing with me, because music was very important to the movement, and that's we would sing, and we would let go, and then we would go out and face the dogs and the hostess, etc. So let's try to sing. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Stayed on freedom, hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. I woke up this morning with my mind. It was stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind. Stayed on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind. It was stayed Yeah, well, the song, this idea, the song I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom was, of course, taken from the Black Church, where, in fact, the song was I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on Jesus. But one of the things about the movement was how eclectic, how inclusive. There were persons of all faith traditions. One of the pictures, I think, behind me is a picture of Rabbi Abraham Heschel marching with Martin King in Selma. The presence, of course, of not only Christians and Jews and Muslims and Buddhists, etc., but there were persons who would not profess any religious faith. But there's something, of course, about the movement that had a magnetism about it, because one, it was simply attempting to be the best human one could be, and to be sure that other human beings had an opportunity to discover their humanity and were not restricted because of race. So it's a music is very important, and I don't know how today's generation and who are some of the singers of music groups that young people listen today. Is there a community perspective? Is there a world perspective? Who do we identify as the justice singers, the justice groups these days is very important. Martin King loved music. He and I love jazz. I love jazz with its improvisation. And as you check his history, Martin King spoke at a Berlin Jazz Festival. He opened it, and I've used that. In fact, I had Duke Ellington come to a church where I was pastor in Boston, and I think I used those words of Martin King as I sort of primed people for that event. So the whole matter of being human, the whole matter of the freedom movement is very inclusive. The arts, music, the poetry of people like Maya Angelou, the whole matter of scholarship, rhythm, etc. I guess one of the things that I would say on camera is that in one of those demonstrations in the South, I of course am a fairly serious person and a quiet person, and I could not understand how after we had marched all day, there were people who were able to sort of party, who were able to let go. But in fact, that was part of the genius of the movement. Another song, we won't sing it, I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. And I think that's important. There was that spirit that even though I am resisting evil, the evil of segregation, the evil of KKK, that nevertheless I am not going to allow that kind of negativity turn me around or squash my humanity that is my own. And no one can take that away from me. And that, of course, was so very important.
We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day Even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
On November 4th, 2008, America elected Barack Obama, its first African American president. Reverend Caldwell examines what this means for America.
You know, in fact, I wrote this for some periodical that, of course, as I was growing up, early on, there was no television. There, of course, was radio. There was a boxer whose name was Joe Louis, the brown bomber. And in certainly black community, and of course in many white houses, of course, we would gather around the radio, hoping that Joe Louis would, of course, would become victorious, sort of pulling for Joe Louis. And sort of the night of November 4th, 2008 was sort of like that in terms of my wife and I. We've been married for 51 years. Both of us grew up in the South, went to segregated schools. Both she and I, the first time we sat in classrooms with students other than black students was when we were in graduate school. I went to Boston University. It was there that I first had that experience. So, of course, our generation, you can imagine what our generation felt when, in fact, this happened. One could not believe, of course, that would ever happen, despite our rhetoric, and certainly not in our lifetime. So, of course, there were tears. But I think it's important to sort of assess what is it? What is it, of course, about that victory that evoked or provoked tears and emotion from a lot of people, even some people who did not support it? Was it an awareness that we in this nation had sort of crossed a chasm? I guess in a sense, race is such a difficult topic for all of us. My own experience, and of course Martin King experienced that so often when you're talking in interracial groups, it's difficult because persons who are not black are sort of fearful of raising questions, or express their uncertainties or express their differences because they don't want to be labeled racist. And those, of course, who are black, who've had the experience of pain and struggle, we sometimes use those moments to sort of let it all out because we'll never have an opportunity to do that. So I think, in a sense, we have to admit that we've sort of submerged a lot in terms of racially. I mean, I think any logical person would be aware of the contradictions racially. And in fact, I think one has to sort of really assess how do we become more open about the contradictions of America. I mean, one of the most obvious, very personal ones is what Strom Thurmond, the white segregationist from South Carolina, who was so anti-black, and yet we discovered that he fathered a child with a black woman who was a servant. You see, you've got that kind of contradiction in America, and within us personally. And so I think I have the feeling that the election of Obama sort of opened some floodgates and released some water that we did not know was there. And then I think so. I'm hoping that it was a kind of catharsis for all persons. But we must be careful that the election of Obama does not give us the impression that we have arrived. that there is no prejudice, etc. That we, as I said earlier, we have miles to go before we sleep. And I guess I want to think that the significant thing that Obama did, and I think this is part of what captured persons, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, etc., was that in his Philadelphia speech, when he, of course, addressed the matter of Jeremiah Wright, he was able, in ways, I think even more so than Martin King, he was able to talk about not only an understanding of black anger and black pain, but also to talk about white resentment or white misunderstanding. And I think that's that's another generation. He was able to do that in ways that I could not do it. But I have a feeling that even people will not admit it, but there is this